On today's video, we're going to be learning about the Gulf Coast. Stretching the southern part of the United States, this coastline starting in Texas works all the way to the deep south and then back into South Florida. We're going to start off in Texas and work our way all the way to Florida, exploring the towns, communities, beaches, and all of the things that this region of the country has to offer. An area known for having some of the most beautiful beaches in the United States, but also natural disasters and economical hardship. On today's video, we're going to learn everything you need to know about the Gulf Coast. We'll start in Texas and work our way all the way to Florida. Padre Island, the southern end of Texas. We'll start our tour here and we'll discover that the Gulf Coast offers a cultural uniformity. This region, despite being vast, you'll notice that the style of houses, the food, the beach vibes, and many of the other regional cultural particularities of the region are vastly the same. So despite the Gulf Coast stretching from Texas to Florida, you'll notice many similarities in the building styles, vegetation, and many of the other things that define the Gulf Coast region. Despite being nearly 1,500 miles across, this region of the country has a uniform style of vegetation, architecture, and even the economy and natural disasters that plague this region are basically uniform. But throughout this journey, there are unique cultural aspects of every particular region of each state. For example, at the start of our tour in Corpus Christi, they're known as having some of the best Mexican food. This region of Texas has Mexican as well as German influences. The Mexican and German influence is reflected both in the music and in the cuisine of this region of the Gulf Coast. While the Mexican cuisine is the staple of this region, you'll notice that it has a heartier flavor, similar to what you would find in German food, giving the Mexican food in this region of the Gulf Coast a distinct flair. Aesthetically, Texas is somewhat of an eyesore with electrical posts and oil rigs dotting the terrain. This coastline is less scenic and more industrial, providing jobs that unfortunately consider this region one of the poorest in the entire country. And interestingly, from Texas to Florida, the Gulf Coast shares uniformly one aspect economically, and that is poverty. Despite having great beaches and tourism, these areas have really struggled to have strong industries. In Texas, while the petroleum industry does provide jobs, it also doesn't provide high-paying jobs, at least in the Gulf Coast region, which means that many of the people living here suffer low incomes. Corpus Christi, while being a gem of an American city, is also a very poor city. Despite the economical difficulties, you'll find that Corpus Christi is a beautiful city overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. The city is split evenly between white and Hispanic population, and both of these populations contribute greatly to the regional culture of this area, with the cultural interchange being so complete that it's almost difficult to distinguish the white from the Hispanic population here, as they're both ethnically almost similar as well as culturally. Corpus Christi was the home of the Queen of Tejano music, Selena, and to this day, she continues to be a legend in this area. You'll find her memorabilia in gas station shops throughout the Texas coast, and in particular here. 17% of the population here lives in poverty, and sadly, a year-to-year increase of almost 2%, as well as a decline in population, mark this area as an economically deprived region. Moving up the coast, you'll find Port Aransas. In the summer and spring, it's a popular destination for students. The town has a reputation of being a little crazy. While a lot of drinking happens in this town, some people just can't control themselves. Once again, you're allowed to drive on the beaches here and even camping apparently. People enjoy these beaches on a large scale when the water gets warm enough. And of course, the typical beach vibes that you'll find throughout the entire Gulf Coast are present here. Port Aransas does have a reputation of being somewhat violent, and many tourists do not return here for that reason. Despite being a beach town, many people even find the vibe somewhat heavy and negative. Thus, it's not exactly the best beach town on the Gulf Coast, kind of plagued with violence, crime, and somewhat of a heavy air that doesn't really feel comfortable. Not exactly the vibe you want for a tourist beach town. From my personal travels, I had somebody from a vehicle throw a glass beer bottle at me, nearly hitting me as I was walking down the sidewalk. Thus, my travel experiences confirm the town's reputation. Further inland, you have towns like Kingsville. These small towns are about 75% Hispanic. Jobs are hard to come across here, and the population here is also in decline. The region's proximity to the border of Mexico means that some of these small towns are plagued with some serious criminal activity. While in this region of the country, a lot of the crime categories like homicides are very low, there's still an element of illegal activity because of the proximity to the border. Now, most of these criminal organizations are trying to keep a very low profile. That means that visibly you may not notice criminal activity at all. But if you pay close attention after living here for a long time, you might notice some strange activities. The proximity to the US-Mexico border means that there's always something interesting moving in the air, and many of the economical activities in this region of Texas are somewhat linked back over to the crime happening across the border. As long as there's a demand in the United States, there will always be a supplier, and this region's geographical location so close to the border, pushing eastward into the United States, means that this is a very high trafficking area. The vast majority of the population on the United States is on the East Coast, and most of the illegal substances are coming from Mexico. Naturally, its geographical location will lend itself to these types of activities. Houston, Texas, the largest city on the Gulf Coast, a city full of its own culture. Hip-hop culture is strong here with artists like Pimp C, Bun B, Paul Wall. This city has contributed greatly to the hip-hop culture, and to this day continues to be a hub for the people of this music subcultures. Despite the Texas sound being unique and standing out heavily throughout the decades, it still continues to catch on throughout various generations, always reinventing itself in a new sound that's bold, different, and uniquely marked by one word, Texas. Despite the fact that Houston in particular has been shaping the hip-hop industry for decades, it always comes out with a new sound that's distinctively Texas, unlike anything else, and despite its unique characteristics, seems to catch on throughout the United States. It's been doing this now for decades, with many artists like SPM coming from a Mexican background, as well as African American and even white with Paul Wall. This is a city where the culture of urban Houston is not defined by a race or by a particular demographic or ethnicity, but simply the identity of being from Texas, an identity that today continues to be marked by the disregard for any type of racial discrimination in their culture, music, and urban subcultures. Despite a resounding Hispanic background, the city is still home to many cultures. Asian, as well as many migrants from all over the world, make Houston their home, making it one of the most diverse cities in the United States. Attracting large suburbs and growth and opportunity, Houston really is a city that is always on the move with its own identity, its own culture. While Atlanta is black and Nashville is country, Houston is a mix of everything that the South has to offer, combining the country with the Hispanic and the African American into one unique culture of Texans that embarks on being more Texan than particularly your demographic. And this is what makes the culture here unique, is that it really embodies all of the largest ethnic groups of the region into one single culture and one single identity, with the Mexican ethnicity bleeding through as the strongest component. The country identity ever present in big pickups and cowboy styles. And finally, the African American culture giving it a final touch of class and style. Houston and the vicinity is definitely a unique cultural hub. While some styles, like the unique car culture, remain somewhat of a regional touch, other parts of Texas culture spread vastly to the United States. And many of the subcultures of Houston and Texas bleed into Louisiana, particularly music as well as car culture. All these are aspects that tie Texas into the following state, Louisiana. And thus, the Texas Gulf Coast is like a rubber band stretching from one culture to the next, uniting various different ethnicities into one single identity, giving Texas a unique cultural mark. But the beaches of Houston are not impressive. You'll notice unsightly industrial aspects related to the petroleum industry. The residents of Houston really have to make the best of what is really an unsightly coastline, as well, again, as somewhat of a criminal element is always present here, giving these beaches not the best vibes. Texas' approach on industry, in particular the oil industry, have not created too many good paying jobs for the people, but it has accomplished to just about destroy the entire Texas coastline with unsightly industrial complexes, incredible amounts of contamination, as well as very low paying jobs. In that aspect, this region really is a failure that the rest of the country depends on, and we can clearly see how when you compare a state like Texas to Florida, you can see the advantages of protecting your natural resources over exploiting them for economical gains. After all, both the coast of Texas and Florida are completely impoverished regions. It's not like this oil industry has brought great wealth to Texas, but it has just about destroyed the entire coastline. Texas' complete disregard for the environment is definitely not going to escape the eyes of tourists who will likely never want to come here again. After all, one of the most beautiful things an area has to offer is its natural scenic beauty, and that has been pretty much wiped off the map, at least for much of the Texas coastline, as industries like petroleum have just about destroyed any scenic aspect that this area could have had. And due to contamination, the air quality is so bad that many residents have actually had to move away from Houston. Despite liking the city, they just couldn't even freaking breathe. And all that for very little economical trade-off. It's not like this region's prospered, but it's been completely destroyed and eliminated and contaminated for centuries to come. A complete loss. Definitely not the best route they could have chosen. The desolation of the Texas coast continues into Beaumont, Texas, right near the Louisiana border. Despite having nearly 100,000 people driving through these city streets, you would think that not a person lives here. In the summer, when the temperatures reach nearly 100 degrees, this really is an unbearable place to live. With poverty, high crime rates, very little actual economical opportunity, jobs that are difficult, don't pay enough, this really is a plagued region, and Beaumont stands out as a sore thumb in Texas as one of the absolute most miserable places you can live in the entire state. Most of the Gulf Coast is marked by scenic beauty, but there's nothing beautiful about what's happened in this region of the Gulf Coast. In this metropolitan area of about 400,000 people, about 22% of the population is living below the poverty line. Beaumont, Texas, synonymous with pollution, has some racial diversity. However, there's a small town on the outskirts of Beaumont, Texas, that has a completely different reputation. Just outside of Beaumont and Houston's diversity is a small town of Vidor, Texas, known to be a freaking sundown town. You would think that by excluding people from their community, they would have a great thing going on. But let's take a look at some of the analytics about this little town known as a sundown town. Less than 0.4% of the population is black here. In 2010, they had lost 7.5% of their population, and in 2020, they repeated again, a decline of 7.5% of their population. A total of about 15% of this area's population has left in the last 20 years, so whatever they're doing in Vidor, Texas certainly isn't working. I always use the word unnatural to describe a place losing population because, after all, it is contrary to nature for a place to actually be losing population instead of growing slowly. But that's what's happening in Vidor, Texas. When even the people that are from here are starting to leave, that should just give you an indication how things in this particular town are going. And those who stay behind are facing a poverty rate of about 15%. But Vidor, Texas marks the end of the Hispanic influence of Texas and the start of the Anglo influence of the Deep South. The road leads us to Lake Charles, Louisiana. This is a miserable place. I guess they have to keep the train behind barbed wire so nobody steals the trains. Entering Louisiana, the Hispanic element is removed. The population here is split almost evenly between half black, half white. Lake Charles, Louisiana has historically had some of the highest crime rates in the United States. On top of that, the area has been plagued with non-stop hurricanes. Between poverty, crime, and natural disasters, Lake Charles, Louisiana really is one of the most challenged towns along the Gulf Coast. Culturally, this town feels more in line with Texas, minus the Hispanic element. Storms, both from nature and economical, have battered this town continually, leaving some of the people defeated with no desire to keep rebuilding over and over again. People's lives here have been destroyed once, again, and then once again, leaving many hopeless with absolutely no desire to achieve anything. 27% of the population is below the poverty line. Sadly, with every new census that comes out, the larger percentage of the population is going into poverty. In most places in the United States, analytics have been slowly improving, but here, things go from bad to worse. As the stock markets go up and up, many people think that we're not facing economical hardships, but across America, particular towns are seeing larger percentage of the population in poverty. Things are going great for the rich and wealthy, the ones who are destroying the landscape in this case, but not too well for the people who have to work these miserable jobs. Lake Charles, Louisiana really is one of the saddest points along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, where industry, not scenic views, dot the landscape. Industries that generate nothing more than pollution and poverty at a great scale. Lafayette, Louisiana, the French and Cajun influence starts to be present, and one of the most beautiful subcultures and regions of ethnicity in the Deep South arises, the Louisiana French. This town has a lot of problems facing. For example, the conditions of the road are some of the most unbearable travel conditions anywhere in the country, with potholes. These roads really are remarkably. The most noticeable thing about the city is how bad the road conditions here are. If there's one positive thing that can be said about Louisiana, it is that they have some of the best cooking cuisine of anywhere in the United States, and Lafayette is a fine specimen of a town when it comes to eating. The poverty rate here is over 18%, and it's not improving. Interestingly, despite being in the Deep South, the town has had a strong reputation of being welcoming to the rainbow people, with a considerable percentage of the population identifying as something other than straight, I guess. But the town is described as a welcoming place according to Wikipedia, an interesting word to associate with the South, a place known for being mostly hostile. The city also brags about having a 6% foreign-born population. Bless their heart, they think that's a lot, but hey, for Louisiana standards, I guess for them that's diversity. Anyways, despite the fact that they brand themselves as being welcoming and they brand themselves as having a considerable foreign-born population, it's really not much different than anywhere else in the South, but they want to brand themselves that way. But don't move too quickly. Despite the fact the town has pride events, the locals do not like you to take photography. They are there, but they don't want to be seen there. Interesting. And this is really the real story for much of the South. I think the South is still in the closet. I think human nature is the same anywhere you go, but in most places in the South, they want to pretend like they're different or better than other people. But in reality, all human nature is the same. And I doubt that in the South, less percentage of people are really that way. They just have to hide it more because the hostile and unwelcoming attitude of many people. But interesting that this contrast starts to become present and evident as you enter what is now known as the Deep South, a place that is definitely not welcoming to outsiders, and in particular anyone being seen at a pride festival. But the reality is that now you're entering a region of the country that really is hostile, and the word welcoming here isn't true. Many people think that Southern hospitality is a welcoming thing, but in reality, the South is a very hostile and unwelcoming place. And many times when people show friendliness or they act like they're okay, they're really just trying to find out more about you. In reality, people here pretend to be friends when they're really not. The Deep South really is, well, a very cold place. And as we move further into the deep south now, we're going to see a lot more of that. You'll see an increase in crime, towns that are declining. The deep south really is suffering. And while you do find towns like this that try to identify in a different way, or they try to reform the way they're perceived by the outside world, it doesn't really change the fact that you're still in the deep south. And there are towns like this one, Lafayette, Louisiana, and Prattville, Alabama, that try to relabel their towns a certain way because there's a small or considerable population among them that they want to emphasize on the fact that these people are there. It doesn't really change the overall context of the Deep South, a place that's unwelcoming and definitely hateful. New Orleans, Louisiana. In 2022, it was the most dangerous city in the United States with a homicide rate of 70 per 100,000, making it the 8th most dangerous city in the world on par with cities in Mexico. Violence here has always been an aspect of life, and New Orleans is once again becoming the murder capital of the United States. While the vibe here is more welcoming than Baltimore, Detroit, and Memphis, people actually go to New Orleans. People don't like to go to Memphis, don't like to go to Baltimore, don't like to go to Detroit for the city's violence. Despite the fact it's a very violent city, people still crowd the streets of New Orleans because New Orleans really is a special place. French, Cajun, Creole, Acadian, all these cultures combine to make New Orleans one of the most beautiful cities in the United States. Its cuisine is among the best of any city in the country, undisputably, with its French influence. Due to Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans lost almost a third of its population, but people are starting to move back and things are starting to change economically in the city. However, crime continues to be a problem for the entire metropolitan area. The city of New Orleans remains heavily segregated, and almost 23% of the population lives below the poverty line. Unfortunately, poverty really is a theme along the Gulf Coast. While most cities that become this dangerous become avoided by tourists, there's something special about New Orleans that continues to attract tourists despite the fact the city has a plague of violence and crime. We enter the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the small town of Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. Its calming waters and tranquil streets are a favorite destination for people vacationing along the Gulf Coast. Somewhat of a laid-back vibe, this is definitely a chill destination for people looking for a quieter escape along the Gulf Coast. While the Mississippi coast doesn't host the best water quality, it is still a great place for people looking to unwind along the Gulf Coast. Gulfport, Mississippi. While it's not the most beautiful and scenic place along the Gulf Coast, it's what they got here in Mississippi and people make the best of it. It is a popular destination as well during the summer as people flock to the coast. The beaches here are not as clear as they are along the Alabama or Florida coast, but once again, it's what people have and they got to work with what they got here. Not even nature is willing to give Mississippi anything decent. We continue our eastward journey to Pascagoula, Mississippi. This is a beach town that's somewhat plagued with a lot of problems. The Mississippi coast really isn't an attractive coastline, and thus it doesn't take going too far inland to find yourself with homelessness, rundown buildings, and despite the fact that this is on the Gulf Coast, there really isn't too much going on here. Going inland, things quickly deteriorate in the Mississippi. Homelessness is visible here. Despite Mississippi claiming to be the state with the least homeless population by percentage, you'll see homeless people here as well. Hurricanes, warm, muggy weather, and of course, over 20% of the population living in poverty. This place really isn't much. Overall, the Mississippi Gulf Coast doesn't really have anything noteworthy of any positivity other than the fact it's somewhat laid back and easygoing. It really is unsightly, even along the coast. Mississippi is one of the worst states in the country, so it's not surprising that even their Gulf Coast isn't much. To the point where even property values overlooking the water are insignificant. The Mississippi coast really is kind of, well, the most empty and least attractive region of most of the Gulf Coast. There really isn't much to look at here. And let's not forget that Mississippi's coast is practically very small. Geographically, it's just a little strip of Mississippi that touches the water. Our journey takes us to Mobile, Alabama. Just like Mississippi, Alabama also has a little slice of the Gulf Coast. Alabama has a lot more to offer than Mississippi along the Gulf Coast, like a large city of Mobile. This region of Alabama has one of the lowest life expectancies in the United States. Moving to this region will take 10 years off your life expectancy. Bad eating, bad habits, extraordinarily high homicide rate, many other life and health metrics come together to make this the lowest life expectancy having region of the entire United States. Think about that. If you move here, take 10 years off your life expectancy. A lot of it comes from homicide, other comes just from reckless behavior. Really, life has no value in this metropolitan area. In Alabama, racism and segregation plays a heavy role in everyday life, a role that has brought poverty, crime, and destruction to these cities. Really, when you enter Alabama, you know you've entered a region of the country where hate dominates, and everyday life is somehow or another affected by these rules, people wanting to live in the past. Mobile, Alabama does have beautiful neighborhoods, but overwhelmingly, the negative overrides the good, and it really is an unpleasant place to live. The city has a large port, and that brings some industry to the area, but overall, living in this city is a sad place to be. Too much crime, too much racism, too much hate. This is definitely Alabama. And Mobile is definitely not a stranger to the many natural disasters that are constantly afflicting this region of the Gulf Coast. From hurricanes to tornadoes, all that is relevant here throughout the entire year. Despite being a large city, 20% of the population here is living at poverty. What's interesting about Alabama is Birmingham, Montgomery, and Mobile used to be the largest cities in the state, at around 200,000 people. Currently, Huntsville, Alabama is the largest city in the state, with Mobile, Montgomery, and Birmingham having had so many problems that the populations are stagnant and in some cases actually declining. Every decade and year, you see a decline in the population of Mobile. Maybe in the 80s, there were around 200,000 people. Now there's about 180,000 people. The population in Mobile continues to decline. People don't want to move here. They know the city's reputation. It's not getting any better. And the people that are from here, even they are getting tired of it and leaving the city. Driving to the city is depressing. It's run down. The colors and the palettes are grays and yellows. Nothing about this area really screams happiness. And for the most part, it's just a depressing, sad vibe. Crime is a huge problem in the city. Alabama currently has the third highest homicide rate in the United States, and large cities like Mobile are plagued with murder. We're not even halfway through 2024, and already the homicides in Mobile exceed 2023. It means that the city is seeing an incredible increase in their homicide rate. Gang violence plays a huge role into the homicide here. Really, there's nothing about this area that would make you want to move here. Population decline, high crime rates, high obesity rates, everything that's bad is prevalent here. Analytically, this is one of the worst places you could end up. And despite being a relatively large city, the cityscape is vastly featureless with very few things to do, very few attractions. Mobile, Alabama absolutely sucks. On the other side of Mobile Bay is Baldwin County. Now, Baldwin County has seen a large population growth, and it is kind of like the nice side of Mobile, you could say. Here, the Gulf beaches are beautiful, the waterways are gorgeous, the population is growing, crime is low, and there's somewhat more of a relaxed vibe than Mobile. Despite the fact that Alabama's coast is small, they're making good use of it in Baldwin County. In contrast to the empty streets of Mobile, Alabama, you'll find shopping plazas, new restaurants, and packed businesses in Baldwin County. And along the coast, you'll find some of the most beautiful beaches of the Gulf. Gulf Shores is really where we start to see the best of the Gulf beaches. Clear water quality, packed hotels. This is a completely different vibe than everything we've left behind to the west of us. As the Gulf Coast turns emerald green, hotels get packed, tourists come, and the cost of coastline becomes increasingly expensive. This is actually the furthest west, you're going to find clear, crystal clear waters, and thus, this is a hotspot for tourism. Alabama's coast is the start of the white sand and beautiful beaches that people think about when they think about the Gulf Coast. Because of its western proximity, Gulf Coast is a very expensive place to stay, as it is the first clear-water beach that people are actually going to find heading eastbound. The clear waters of the Gulf of Mexico here open the way for construction, growth, opportunity, tourism, and better environments. No longer is the coastline dominated by the oil and gas industries. Here, the coastline is dominated by fishing, tourism, boating, and of course, retirement. Powerful cold fronts suck energy out of the Gulf of Mexico and push it into the east coast of the United States. Tornadoes are not out of the question here. Powerful rainstorms. The true beauty of the Gulf of Mexico, these powerful thunderstorms, these rain bands that hold tornadoes, this is where they gather their strength from. And as they move further to the east, they bring a path of destruction to Alabama and to the Mid-South. But here, along the coast, you can witness the beauty of a powerful band of rain coming into the coastline. Moving with it, a cold front, a change in weather. This is the Deep South. What many are calling the new Tornado Alley. In southern Alabama, weather really is a powerful event. From tornadoes to powerful rain bands, here, several inches of water can fall rapidly with winds and gusts, and along the coast, a beautiful spectacle of nature, a storm rolling in from the Gulf of Mexico. The white sands and clear waters that start in Alabama continue for over 100 miles along the Florida Panhandle. The first large city that we encounter is Pensacola, with some of the most beautiful beaches in the state. Tall white dunes of sand dot the landscape, both wide and long. This is the longest stretch of white beach sands anywhere in the United States. You've now entered the Florida Panhandle, an area that relies heavily on tourism and gives visitors the opportunity to see some of the whitest sands and clearest waters you'll find anywhere in the United States. The abundance of pure white sand in this region marks a difference from the beaches further to the west. You have now entered the Emerald Coast, one of Florida's most beautiful natural attributes. You leave behind the pale and depressing colors of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and sadly a lot of Texas, and blue skies, green grass, white sand, and crystal clear waters give a new element, a new fresh revival of life. You're now entering the most beautiful coastline that Florida has to offer. While along the beaches of Pensacola Beach, the tourists enjoy the beautiful natural settings, however, the reality of life in the actual town of Pensacola is a little different. While along the coast, the natural settings and the forts of the past create nostalgic vibes, the reality of present-day life is resounding when you enter the actual city of Pensacola. 16% of the population here is below the poverty line. That's considerably less than many of the other towns we saw further west, but still very high. However, the problem of Pensacola is that it has the highest drug overdose rate of the entire state of Florida. With 70 out of 100,000 people dying from an overdose, this area is dealing with a huge plague of addiction, and thus the reality of current times sets in that Pensacola has very little to offer. The stretch of tourism is limited, and in the Florida Panhandle, the tourist season is during the summer, when the beaches are warm enough to swim in. People from Alabama, Mississippi, and the entire Deep South come to these beaches to enjoy. But during the winter, when it's too cold to enjoy the beaches, this area is economically deprived and thus has very little opportunity, and income is hard to come by here. Geographically, Pensacola is far removed from the rest of the state, being the westernmost city in the entire state. The nearest city of any considerable size is Tallahassee, and even that is a considerable drive. Pensacola is far from the rest of Florida. The entire state is about 17 to 22% Hispanic, but here the Hispanic population is about a quarter of what it would be in other regions of the state. Not only is it geographically different, the demographics of this area mirror the adjacent states in the south and are still distant from the rest of Florida. Unfortunately, because of Florida's laws, many people from Alabama, Mississippi, and other adjacent states that are plagued with crime, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, are the top 3 most dangerous states in the country with the highest homicide rates, as well as those states have very strict laws on addiction and use. With some of the worst prison systems in the country, many of the criminals from those adjacent states move to Pensacola, where they can enjoy relative safety from the law and its punishment while still being geographically close to the area they're from. Thus, Pensacola, while it is within Florida, has become kind of a dumping ground for criminals from other states, and that is why the addiction rates here are the highest in the state of Florida. As adjacent states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana have strict laws and horrible prison systems, many people that are dealing with crimes or already have a criminal record find that if they move to Pensacola, Florida, they can be close to home but not have to deal with the prison systems and many of the other complications of living in the strict Deep South. Fanatical right-wing individuals are also very common. These people create protests and they put up banners, and they're constantly agitating the people in this area. And many people who've lived in this area say that one of the worst things about living here is how politically charged this city is, making life for the person who's not interested in politics somewhat unattractive. So while we've entered the state of Florida geographically, culturally, for all senses, Pensacola is more deeply tied into the Deep South that we're leaving behind. But as we move forward, that becomes less and less as we open way to beach towns that are beautiful, flourishing, and detached regionally from the Deep South. Destin, Florida, arguably one of the best beaches along the Gulf Coast. Without a doubt, this stretch of the Gulf Coast has the clearest waters of anywhere in this region. Accordingly, with just beautiful beaches comes a level of wealth and elegance that so far has been lacking in the Gulf Coast. Destin is one of those enclaves of wealthy people, and communities like this continue all the way up to Panama City Beach. With towns like Rosemary Beach, where properties push into the millions of dollars, you have now entered a part of the Gulf Coast that is more in line with wealth and opulence than it is with poverty. The architecture here complements the vegetation. People go for walks, tourists, beach homes. Even you start to see second homes. These are individuals who have a nicer, bigger home in another part of the country, but have a beach home in Florida to enjoy during certain parts of the year. Here, palm trees are abundant. Buildings are light colored. The vibe is a slow and mellow, peaceful place. Along the coastlines here, you'll find levels of peace, tranquility, serenity, and relaxation that you have perhaps never experienced in your life. This really is a peaceful place. The only sounds you hear are the waves and the birds. At Blue Mountain Beach, people enjoy the nature, the white sand, the clear waters, and surfing in the waves of the Gulf of Mexico, waiting until the sunset, the spectacle that ends the day. At which point, people leave the beaches and head to seafood restaurants to enjoy the rest of their evening. Here in Seaside, Florida, real estate property values along the coast get into the handful of millions, and owning property here is a privilege reserved for the absolute wealthy. Panama City Beach, the Gulf of Mexico, continues to offer white sands, clear waters. In the summertime, this is the vacation, spring break destination for people throughout the South. In the wintertime, when the Gulf waters are too cold to go for a swim, Panama City Beach is a calm and peaceful place where the locals are able to enjoy serenity and quiet along the coast of the Gulf. However, when the Gulf waters warm up, all that changes.
Welcome to Panama City Beach!
Illinois, that's a long way.
Birmingham.
Birmingham. All right, man. Yeah, I know Birmingham. Throughout the summer, Panama City Beach is perhaps the most fun place to be for young people anywhere in the United States. PCB is the king of spring break and one of the most fun places to spend the summer in the South, if not the entire country. At times, Panama City Beach can get a little out of hand, but overall, it really isn't a bad place to be. The cultures of the South come here to be on display. The squatted truck scene, whatever is happening culturally in the Deep South, gets put on a pedestal here on Panama City Beach. Whether it's the music, the car culture, or whatever, the clothing styles, anything that's subculture and has to do with the U.S. South. In the summertime, it's going to be on display here in Panama City Beach. The tourists here come from states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, which are the most dangerous states in the country, so violence here is a little bit more common than in other Florida beaches, but nonetheless, it is still a destination you should never overlook. Panama City Beach is La Farandula, the place where the vibes, cultures, and styles of the year are put on display. Whatever brands and styles are prominent here are likely going to have a very good year elsewhere. This is where the youth decides what's cool, what's in, and what's out.
Yo, hi, bro.
Some people start that drinking early too. This is Panama City Beach, the real Panama City Beach, not the ones you see on the news. Sadly, spring break, which is the heart of Panama City Beach, has received a lot of criticism in media over the last few years. However, I have found myself that I have never really had any problems. Most of the bad things that happen here happen late at night, so if you pack it up early, in the daytime, the vibes are wholesome, the people are great and fun, and I can say that I have personally never encountered individuals here on the streets that have been any issue to me. I've always had a great time, enjoyed myself, and I definitely recommend that you check out Panama City Beach despite the fact of all the negative news coverage. Currently, the state's governor has gone on a culture war against spring break, Disney World, and many of the other attractions that attract young people to the state of Florida. However, that doesn't really define the truth about Florida, a place where young people from all over the country come and have a great time every single year, and predominantly, you are generally very safe. But the media campaigns against these Florida attractions isn't going to deter people who've come here, experienced it, and fallen in love with the best beaches that Florida has to offer along the Florida Panhandle. However, the beaches that tourists enjoy isn't the reality of the residents of Panama City. Here, incomes are low, and the vast majority of people struggle with the seasonality of the place. With the money coming around the summer and disappearing for the rest of the year, the people that live full-time here have a lot of struggles. One, finding jobs that pay. Second, the cost of housing increasing since tourism and vacation rentals have swallowed up a lot of the nice, decent housing, leaving only places that are more run down available for the locals. Let's not forget that this area has also been hit back to back by strong hurricanes. And in this, we find that even in Florida, the Gulf Coast lives up to its reputation of being an impoverished area. In Florida, you do have the tourism, and along the beaches, it's beautiful and fun. But again, once you head far inland, you'll find that much of this region of Florida is no different than any of the other impoverished regions of the Gulf Coast, with some added complications. The complications of incomes being seasonal, hurricane aftermaths being almost impossible to overcome for years. It only takes going a few miles inland to find yourself back in the Deep South again. We turn the bend of Florida's peninsula and find ourselves now in Mexico Beach. Yet another destructive hurricane, yet another nightmare of living along the Gulf Coast. Here in Mexico Beach, a storm came through and absolutely decimated this place. Many years afterwards, the rebuilding process is still not completed. Here along the coast, however, being the homes of the upper class, people are able to rebuild. However, it's taken several years for this town to return to what it formerly was, and now perhaps even better than it was before. And that is the story of Florida. While the rich along the coast are able to rebuild even better, the people far inland are left struggling with these hurricanes impacts for years. And in some of the more impoverished areas, even for decades. The storms may come through and destroy an entire region of the state. The areas along the coast, the rich people in a few years get back better than were before. But as you look further back, the mobile homes several miles inland and poor communities, the recovering process of hurricanes is definitely a huge burden along the Gulf Coast. And it is true for all the states along the Gulf Coast, from Texas to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, that all of these states, in some way or another, life can come to a quick end with one single storm. Michael, Ian, Katrina, storms like this completely changed the lives of people that live along the Gulf Coast, and that is why perhaps many people are afraid to invest long-term into this region of the country, because they know that these storms can change life for years, overnight. From here we enter the Big Bend region, Florida's empty coast. There's actually an entire video just like this one on my YouTube channel that completely breaks down the Big Bend region of Florida. This region doesn't have any large towns, so I'm just going to summarize it. It's mostly small towns, fishing communities. There literally are no beaches anywhere along this area of any significant value, thus tourism is almost insignificant, except for the coastal charm of a few communities. You'll find places like Tarpon Springs and other areas along here, small towns like Cedar Key that attract a lot of tourism, but overall this coast of Florida is fairly empty, fairly undiscovered, and mostly just the charm and emptiness of these towns attract tourists to a region of Florida that is otherwise vacant of large cities, just coastal vibes, beautiful little towns. Along this region of Florida, however, homelessness and addiction in north central Florida is a huge problem, and you'll find that this area has a lot of struggles to overcome. Much of the growth and development that has taken place further into Florida has not touched this region. It really remains somewhat untouched and somewhat of a time capsule of what Florida was before development. If you'd like to learn more about this region of the Gulf Coast, check out Florida's Big Bend region, the Empty Coast YouTube video on my channel. The beaches that disappeared along Mexico Beach reappear again in Clearwater, Florida. The Big Bend region was absent of clear white sands, but once again when you enter Clearwater Beach, not only does the sand return, but the palm trees and a more tropical vibe. As the name would suggest, the waters along the coast of Tampa are absolutely clear, pristine. People enjoy seeing manatees, dolphins, sharks, fishing. This really is a prime travel destination. Clearwater Beach remains one of the most unique places you can visit in the state of Florida if you're looking for an experience of coastal vibes. Just like those who visit Panama City Beach fall in love, the same thing happens with the people who visit Clearwater Beach. Once you come here once, you're always going to want to come back to enjoy this place. The difference is that here, it's a little bit more elegant, a little bit more prestigious, and a little bit less deep south. The Tampa metropolitan area isn't quite South Florida with its tropical Caribbean vibes, but it combines the South Florida vibe with the Florida Panhandle vibe and gives you something in the middle. Clearwater Beach is something like a perfect balance between the fun of the Florida Panhandle with the elegance of South Florida without the Caribbean flair, but also without the Southern. It's kind of like a balance, something in the middle for somebody who likes a mild, calm, relaxing beach experience without being overwhelmed by the Caribbean culture of the South Florida vibe and the Southern culture of the Panama City, Florida Panhandle vibe. It's something in the middle, more calm, more mild, more relaxing, where the cultural aspects of the region don't overshadow the scenic serenity of the place. Here, the tourist season is actually evenly distributed throughout the year. Some people come during the summer for the warm beaches, some people come during the winter to escape the cold, and thus, Clearwater is somewhat of a seasonal city. The city of Clearwater is empty during the hot summer and full during the winter, but some people do go to the beaches during the summer, which balances off with a mix throughout the year, except for if you head further inland, then it literally becomes a ghost town during the summer. The heat and the humidity unbearable. You'll find that during some parts of the hot summer, Clearwater feels something like a ghost town, devoid of life, completely empty, in stark contrast to the vibes you have during the winter that the tourists enjoy. And in many respects, the tourists get to see the great part of Clearwater during the best time of the year to see it, but they perhaps are not aware of the reality of living here full time throughout the whole year. Once the tourist leaves, the vibes change. It becomes an emptier place, devoid of life, you could say. Across from the Skyway Bridge, Ana Maria Island along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. These beaches attract both tourists and Floridians as well. In the wintertime, the snowbirds come down to escape the cold. In the spring break, many people of youth come to enjoy the beaches. Then after all that, when it finally gets warm enough in the summer, the people from Orlando come to enjoy Ana Maria Island because it's finally the time of the year where the water temperature is perfect to go for a swim. And thus, Ana Maria Island is again seasonal in nature, but has peaks throughout the year, particularly during the winter, during spring break, and in the summer when people from Orlando come to visit. Ana Maria Island is right outside of Bradenton, Florida. Bradenton in itself isn't that much of a seasonal city. However, if you go further down into Sarasota, you'll find that just like Clearwater, it's somewhat of a ghost town during the summer and absolutely packed during the winter. Ana Maria Island is said to be one of the best beaches in Florida with clear waters. Manatees commonly approach people here on the beaches. It's not uncommon to see sharks, dolphins, and manatees along this coastline where people enjoy metal detecting, fishing, sunbathing, and just relaxing along some of the most beautiful beaches of Manatee County. With proximity to the Sarasota and the Tampa airport, this area sees tourists from throughout the country and throughout the world, bringing somewhat of a nice mix of people to the area throughout the year. It's not uncommon to find people here from far parts away of the world coming to see our beaches here in Florida. While in the winter the so-called snowbirds dominate, you'll find that in the summer license plates from the Orlando area are the most common you're going to see at the beaches. Now, that metropolitan area has a lot of people from Venezuela and Puerto Rico and Colombia, as well as Brazil, countries that have a lot of beaches, but the Orlando area doesn't have beaches, and many of them choose to come down Interstate 4 and find themselves here on Ana Maria Island, enjoying our beaches during the hot summer. On Ana Maria Island, water clarity is usually pretty good, and it varies throughout the year. It's definitely not as clear as Destin or Panama City Beach, but during some parts of the year, the water clarity here becomes very enjoyable, and a few times of the year, you can almost say it's on par with the Florida Panhandle beaches. With the only difference is that here on Ana Maria Island, it's warmer much longer throughout the year, which means that the swimming season is considerably larger here in Ana Maria Island than it is along the Florida Panhandle, where being further north, the water temperatures are cooler, and those beaches can only be enjoyed simply during the summer if you enjoy swimming. Bradenton Beach, Florida. A powerful thunderstorm rolls over Tampa Bay and heads far inland. In the Florida summer, when the days get hot enough, eventually they break out into heavy rains. In the backwater, people enjoy fishing, crabbing, boating, sailing, while towards the beaches, the traffic jams build up. Right next to Ana Maria Island, these places are very similar, except for in Bradenton Beach, the water clarity is noticeably clear. Bradenton Beach has to be one of my personal favorite beaches in Florida. Here you can enjoy clear waters, great vibes. Parking is free and usually abundant. Very similar and geographically close to Ana Maria Island, these are definitely some of the best places to enjoy a beach stay in Florida. You'll start to notice that here the vegetation starts to look more tropical. You're now starting to enter the cultural region of South Florida, known for its Caribbean cuisine, vibrant nightlife since the days are too hot. By the time you hit Sarasota, Florida with its beaches like Siesta Key, you know you are in a tropical paradise now. The vegetation, the food, the culture, everything here is South Florida tropical. You start to see people wearing more tropical clothes, more Margaritaville, more shirts with flowers, more colorful outfits. The dresses are smaller, the thongs are thinner. Everything about this part of Florida is different. You're now entering a place where it's tropical vibes, Caribbean feel. This is a different world here. This is where music is louder, the days are hotter, the nights are cooler, nightlife is longer. You are entering South Florida. Siesta Key Beach is said to be the greatest beach in the United States. And I can almost agree. I personally like Bradenton Beach and Anna Maria Island more, but for the tourists, I can see why they think Siesta Key is incredible. This is a place where the water is clear, and it's warm, and it's enjoyable. People love this area. Sarasota is also a very safe city. Thus, you don't have to worry about too much on the sand. Even on weeknights, people stay up till 2 in the morning outside hanging out, especially during the winter. The nightlife is long, the parties are awesome. This is Siesta Key Beach after all, a site that's visited by people throughout the entire world for its fame of being the best beach in the United States. Young people from all over the world come here to enjoy clear waters, warm water, clear white sand, and of course the vibes, the tropical island feel of Siesta Key. Sarasota beaches are definitely enjoyable, and this has to be again one of the better parts of the entire Gulf Coast region. Moving further south, you'll find the quiet retirement community of Venice, Florida, with its beautiful fishing pier and horrendous red tide. The contamination of the Gulf here has more to do with other reasons. Many people blame Big Sugar, other people blame the vast amounts of homelessness contaminating the water. If it wasn't for the plague of the red tide, which kills the fish and makes people who are asthmatic feel very sick, and of course the snouty old people that live here, this could almost be a perfect place to live. The sand here in Venice isn't as white as in Sarasota, and in fact sometimes walking barefoot on the sand on a hot day almost burns your feet off. The sands here are not white, the water is not as clear, the people are older. Venice, as the name would suggest, is somewhat of an elegant, clean city, and it's a fast-growing area, part of the Sarasota metropolitan area. These regions are some of the fastest-growing areas in the entire country, with new home construction literally out of control in the eastern outskirts of Venice. But as the Charlotte Harbor takes up a lot of landmass, you'll find that there aren't really that many great beaches anything south of here, leaving much of the coastline here kind of mangroves and great places to fish, but not exactly great beaches. Sanibel Island wraps around much of the coast of Lee County, leaving Charlotte County kind of with very few options for beaches. Minnesota Key being kind of one of the exceptions, but the water clarity and the sand whiteness here simply cannot compete with what you have in Sarasota. You'll start to notice here more coconut trees, more Royal Cuban palm trees. The vegetation here now takes a turn for the more tropical. Boca Grande, a small point here, kind of being the exception, where you will find beautiful clear white beaches. Kind of one of the few areas here. As you can see, there's islands that are kind of barrier islands, which means for a good stretch of coastline you don't actually have beaches, and most of these islands don't have roads. Boca Grande being one of the few islands that does have roads, being a popular destination for people boating, fishing, as well as enjoying white sand beaches. Being tropical coastline and not having too many white sand beaches, Boca Grande's real estate prices are absolutely astronomically expensive, with much of the old money here coming from other places like Naples that have become overbuilt. This place continues to hold on to kind of a small island feel, despite the fact it's a very attractive piece of real estate that many people would like to develop. It still remains small, quiet, and quaint. Boca Grande really is an undiscovered gem to many who don't realize the beauty this little place has to offer. At the pass, you'll find some of the best fishing spots this entire region has to offer. The sand here is really nice and clean, kind of an exception to the rule of anywhere else you can reach by car in this region of the Charlotte Harbor. Sanibel and Captiva wrap around much of the coast of Lee County, Florida. Hurricane Ian brought a 9-foot storm surge to this area. Before the hurricane, these were exclusive and expensive areas to live. After the hurricane, years of cleanup efforts to bring this island back to what it was before. Sadly, Sanibel Island today is still in the recovery process of one of the most destructive hurricanes that has ever hit Southwest Florida. While a storm surge destroyed everything in the bottom, sustained winds of 155 miles an hour destroyed everything on top. The recovery process for Sanibel Island to be what it was before will be years in recovery. In the meantime, things are starting to little by little go back to normal, but there's work here for years to come to bring Sanibel to what it was before. The destruction of these islands has moved much of the tourism that originally came to Lee County, Florida, to other counties in the state. This area is going to have many years to recover. However, while on land we'll be able to clean up the damage of the storm surge, it is unclear for how many decades, if not centuries, the contamination that was put into the Gulf of Mexico will be around. They're still pulling entire boats out of the water as well as cars many years later. It seems like for now, the recovery process of Lee County's coast will be very extensive. Despite that, real estate prices have not let down in this region. Interesting, since there's no beaches to enjoy here. The locals say that the water clarity has never been the same. The people who fish say the fishing's never been the same, and it really isn't the same anymore. Despite that, the real estate prices continue to soar in this area, and we can see that along the Gulf Coast, it's not just the poor communities that are suffering from hurricane damages. The rich communities also have to deal with the power of the Gulf of Mexico, the powerful hurricanes which destroy everything in their path. Perhaps Hurricane Ian has been the absolute worst that has hit anywhere. Unless you ask somebody from New Orleans, they're going to tell you that it was Katrina. But regardless, these powerful storms continue to reshape the Gulf Coast of Florida. And any state along the Gulf of Mexico can face the same situation. In one day, a storm surge, a heavy wind, and everything on the ground is destroyed, and many years of recovery are in progress. The wealthy are able to have second homes. These are not these people's primary homes. But for the poor people that live along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, these types of events are life-changing. And for some, even those who are able to afford it, it's overwhelming to see the destruction of your property. And in many circumstances, even after rebuilding, you are once again hit with another natural disaster. And this is perhaps what has kept much of the Gulf Coast from being able to have strong real estate values. So why, if South Florida has been destroyed like this, is the real estate market here strong? The reason is simple. Despite all of the places we've talked about on today's list having a summer tourist season, when you get down here, you have purely a winter tourist season because the waters are warm enough to swim throughout the entire year. And in December, when it's snowing in most of the country, there's only one place that the ultra wealthy are going to be, and that is South Florida. From Fort Myers onward, you're going to find that the water temperature is warm enough to swim even in December. Clearly, no matter what happens in this area in the winter, this is warm, this is tropical, and this is where the wealthy people are going to want to be. If they have to rebuild, so be it. So much so that even many of the challenges that face this area, like contamination from the hurricane storm surge, anything that faces this area is insignificant. The only significant matter here is that in December, in January, when it's cold and icy in most of the country, it's hot and warm and sunny here. And many of the year-round problems that plague South Florida are insignificant to these people who are wealthy and are only coming here to spend a few months to get away from the cold. For them, it's worth it. The absolute worst of Hurricane Ian was Fort Myers Beach, where a 14-foot storm surge left houses completely underwater. The destruction here is massive, but many efforts are happening to revitalize this area. Many of the houses here were old huts, what I call cockroach huts from the 60s and 70s, that could never stand up to today's current building codes, which means that whether the people that live here are not like it, they're going to have to adapt to a new building code, new construction styles, which many of the locals feel is going to strip away the small town island feel of the area. But unfortunately, when you have a 14-foot storm surge that wipes away all the cockroach huts, you got to start all over again. and you got to start all over again up to the new building codes. Clearly, after a 14-foot storm surge, Fort Myers Beach will never be the same, but businesses are coming back and a new style is starting to emerge, more colorful, more vibrant, and up to better building codes is starting to be somewhat of a little bit of what Fort Myers Beach used to be. This is the new Fort Myers Beach with less tourists, as there's still a long way to go before this place can be what it used to be before. And to be honest, it'll never be what it used to be before. You can't go back and be what you used to be before, but you can move forward and be better. Spring break in 2024 saw a very small revival of tourists come back to the area, and Fort Myers Beach is reshaping itself into a new Fort Myers Beach. Unfortunately, for many of the people that wanted Fort Myers Beach to be exactly what it was before, it seems like the crowds are younger and the resorts are bigger and the crowds are a little bit louder. Perhaps this isn't what they wanted to happen to their island, but it's what's becoming of this place. You can still see some of the signs of destruction from the hurricane, and there's still a long way to go. The crowds are younger, they're definitely not the same people who were here before, and this is a changing face of Fort Myers Beach, turning to somewhat more of a Panama City Beach or a Clearwater type of vibe. The old Fort Myers Beach completely erased. So glad it's gone. New Latin food trucks, fresh grass, new businesses, and a new life to a place that was completely wiped off the map and now is coming back in a completely different vibe. Many of the old timers feel hurt by these changes, but unfortunately for them, this is the new Fort Myers Beach. Whether you like it or not, you can't go back in time. Lover's Key State Park outside of Bonita Springs had about a 9 to 10 foot storm surge, wiping out most of the structures on the island. However, the sands, the beaches, and the vegetation are actually able to withstand these storm surges and come back great. And because it was a preserved land, just about everything here was natural, Lover's Key State Park is starting to make a comeback despite the fact some of the structures are gone. The general look of the place is identical, and it's starting to be what it used to be before. Lover's Key State Park is a great place for fishing and, of course, enjoying nature. The heart of Estero Bay. There is contamination here and cars floating out in the middle of the Gulf, but for now, Lover's Key State Park is actually somewhat starting to look like before the hurricane, since after all, nature is able to recover a whole lot quicker than humans. A favorite home for stingrays, always be careful, there's a lot of nature in these waterways. Bonita Springs and Bonita Beach suffered greatly from Hurricane Ian's storm surge, and the area is working to rebuild. Bonita Springs is just about filled up already, and with its many waterways, a lot of the hurricane damage went far inland, which means that many people in Bonita Springs lost their home during the hurricane, and they are now rebuilding Bonita Springs. Beautiful beaches, horrible location for storm surge. The sand here took months to clear, and this area really was a complete disaster zone. Thankfully, the area is starting to get back to normal, and things are looking a lot better for Bonita Springs. Bonita Beach, back then, were some of the best beaches in Florida, but for now, it's still a lot of work to do in this area. The amount of aluminum and wood and garbage and contamination that found its way into these waterways, however, I don't know how long it's going to take to clear that part up. It seems like some of that will be around for many, many decades, if not centuries. Wiggins Pass Beach, Naples, Florida. This area had about a 7-foot storm surge. However, because there are many natural areas here with mangroves, they absorbed a lot of the impact from the storm surge, which means the areas just a few miles inland were unaffected by the storm surge. The water came up slowly and then it came back down. There wasn't this destruction here like you saw in other places. Low-lying properties did have storm surge damage, but it wasn't a destructive force like in other places. In Naples, Florida, you have some of the most expensive real estate in the United States. Properties here can get into the hundreds of millions, and even a small piece of land overlooking the water can be as much as $20 million. Naples, Florida is now on par with San Francisco, New York, and Miami, among the places where the absolute most wealthy people on the entire planet have to have a home. It's a beautiful city because it's in South Florida and enjoys warm weather throughout the whole year, and during the winter months, this is where people who have money want it to be. The coast of Naples, Florida has a lot of preserved lands and wooded areas, and these areas acted somewhat of a buffer to protect the storm surge from completely annihilating Naples like it did in Fort Myers. These coastal areas proved to be a buffer, protecting Naples from a storm surge that hit up to 9 feet in some areas in Collier County. Because of its white sand beaches, abundance of wildlife, and of course being at the tip of southern Florida with warm weather throughout the whole year, Naples, Florida has some of the most extensive real estate values of anywhere in the state. Here, housing that would cost you $200,000 somewhere else is easily into the millions of dollars. Money here is absolutely no obstacle, and some of the wealthiest people on the entire planet have homes in Naples, Florida. It really is a town reserved for the absolute most exclusive wealthy people. However, the regular working class people that live in this county have a very difficult time making a salary. It seems that despite the fact that these people that have these properties are wealthy, they have no intention of sharing their wealth, and there's a huge income disparaging in this county, with the upper 1% making 72 times more than everybody else. While the average person living in Naples, Florida is of affluent means, the poor people here have a very difficult time. Everything costs as much as if you were absolutely wealthy, which means that they have to stretch their miserable incomes very far to make a living in this beautiful place. I lived in Naples, Florida for 20 years of my life, and it really is the bottom of the map when it comes to the Florida Gulf Coast. Many people falsely assume because Naples, Florida has so many wealthy people that it must be an easy place to make a living. However, if you look very closely, there are very few industries here, and that is how the average working class person makes a living. Dependency on wealthy people and taking care of their properties when they're not here is again somewhat seasonal. In the wintertime, Naples, Florida is packed, abundantly packed, irritatingly packed. Yet in the summer, it becomes a complete ghost town. And that in itself also creates a very hostile business environment for people who live here year-round. Beyond Naples is Marco Island, the 10,000 Islands, the Florida Everglades, the absolute end of civilization. Here, Florida panthers, alligators, giant snakes, and much wildlife enjoys seclusion in areas that are now protected. This is the end of today's journey through the Gulf Coast. We started in Texas, we moved to the deep south, and we end our journey at the southern tip of Florida. The 10,000 Islands, the Florida Everglades, one of the wildest places in North America, where large reptiles, jungles of tropical vegetation, and a few adventurous tourists who discover one of the most hostile environments you'll find anywhere in the United States. This is the end of our tour of the Florida Gulf Coast, Texas Gulf Coast, and of course, the Deep South. The Gulf of Mexico, wrapped around the United States, some of the most beautiful beaches as well as some of the most disparaging poverty of anywhere that you'll find in the United States. While you'll find alligators throughout the Gulf Coast, here in the Florida Everglades, you'll find the largest concentration of alligators, as well as in Collier County, close to 1,000 black bears. The Florida Everglades really is a wild place that pretty much embodies what is the Gulf Coast.